You know, our home is here in Santa Fe. This is where we work. This is where our children go to school. This is our community. And what can we do? What is needed here that is not presently being done? We said, okay, families, this is what we would wind up doing. So in the early parts of 1987, we went and looked at different types of facilities. Carl talked to a particular bank in town who was ready to foreclose on an old, very old, dumpy motel that was called the Desert Chateau. And we went over and took a look at this motel. And the women were on the verge of tears and the men were just shaking their heads because it had already been being used by the homeless.
You're looking through a window, and I'm looking through this window and I'm trying to decipher exactly what I'm seeing, and all of a sudden everything on the other side of the window started moving and running. There were people already living in that building, homeless, already living there.
Windows were broken, things were pulled off, the sinks were pulled off of the walls. It was pretty bad. As a nurse, by my profession, what I started looking at is that, okay, few things have to happen. One, if this is going to be for families, then we need to really make sure that we keep families together and that parenting continue. And so we stocked as many of the rooms as we could, finished doing a huge amount of cleaning one day in September. And we thought, well, you know, we were starting, so there was like 4 of us sitting around talking in terms of what are we going to do now? We need to really have some kind of an opening. We're going to have someone who's going to be like a resident manager, just like thinking of a motel. And, you know, where is this person going to come from? And this was like, you know, early evening in September, and all of a sudden a police officer drove up with a young woman in his car and said that you know, she had a child and was a Native American young woman, and that they had no place to go. And the child was young enough, there really wasn't a way of the small child going into the other shelter. There was no programs available that could help with motel rooms or anything that could make them safe for the night. So we opened opened up one of the rooms, and that first situation is basically this was a young woman and her child were there. And we never did have a grand opening. That was in September of 1987. And, you know, we're now into 2007. Well over 21,000 lives have been touched by the program started by these little folks who truly didn't know what it meant to open up a homeless shelter, didn't know what kinds of things we were going to get involved in, but knew that we had the desire to help and a desire to make things better for folks. As with many things with Carl, he was wonderful at starting things. He was absolutely phenomenal at support with whatever he did. But then he would sort of move on to doing the other things. And so it was left to, okay, the rest of us with what are we going to do? And so I emerged as the leader. At that time, I worked in Los Alamos. I was the nursing administrator, and so had a full-time job there. I also did lots of activities in terms of our church, but I would go to work, and then when I got off work, I would come and then stop by the shelter, see how everything was going. Then I'd usually go on home and have dinner, and then go back to the shelter. There were other times where I actually would go and to the shelter and stay until evening because someone had to give some direction. Funding for the program when we first began was actually from Carl and our family income. We didn't have any means of doing any kind of fundraising at that time. Of course, we were brand new in the community, no one knew us. And we would start getting a little bit more of that feel that this has to be a community program. the work has to involve the community, and the community has to participate, because that's the right thing to do, and this was a service that was so vitally needed. From day 3 of when we opened, we were full all the time. And usually there were families that were needing to come into the shelter that we just didn't have room for. And then probably the thing that impacted our program and our whole agency was that in December of 1988, Carl died in an auto accident. We had been looking at a program to do something with youth as well in Moriarty, actually, and he was on his way back from visiting that part of the community of the state when it was a one-car accident, and he died instantly. And this actually happened on Christmas Eve of 1988. So that was real hard. That was that next bit of time. You know, I had things that had to be taken care of, and you know, we still had, you know, the building was full, the shelter was full. Still had, you know, my full-time job up in Los Alamos, and for the next, you know, few weeks it was real hard. It was real hard.